This is Outrageous History. Welcome to Outrageous History. I'm Ernest Granson. Do you dread extended family dinners? Do you cringe when certain relatives dredge up awkward incidents from the past? Well, don't worry. Even royal families experience those uncomfortable moments. Take, for instance, the family get-together at the Isle of Wight in 1909 between the family of King Edward VII and the Romanovs, the Tsar Nicolas's family. I'm sure that King Edward didn't bring up the shooting of unarmed demonstrators in St. Petersburg in 1905 by the Tsar's imperial forces in the Bloody Sunday Massacre. That would really make everybody feel uncomfortable. After all, Edward was Nicholas's uncle, and Nicholas's wife, Tsarina Alexandra, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria, who was Edward's mother. And there were many other family connections as well with royals all through Europe. But those family connections would not be enough to save Nicholas and his family from being executed by the Bolsheviks in 1918, following the Russian Revolution of 1917. To talk about that family dinner and the entangled world of royal families, we have writer and historian Nancy Bilyeau with us. Nancy, thanks so much for being here with us today.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here and to discuss the royals.
Well, everybody wants to hear about that. And, you know, the connection between the ruling family in Britain and the ruling family in Russia is just one example of how so many of Europe's royal families were and are closely linked, isn't it?
Well, what happened was that Queen Victoria had a great many children, and she was very partial to marrying them to other royals. And what happened, though, is that there was this interweaving of Protestant families, because it was even illegal for the rulers of England to marry a Catholic. And so the other large Protestant group was in Germany. So that's why there is the English royal family is so German, as many people know. They kept marrying German princesses and princes, Victoria's husband, notably. What happened with the Romanovs is that actually the British royal family didn't really like the Romanovs or Russia. For a very long time, there was this antipathy. There was the Crimean War and other situations where they felt that, and this actually comes into this dinner and beyond, that in England, whether it's the members of the royal family, not so much, but the rulers of the real rulers of the country, the ministers and the thinkers, the intellectuals, really hated what was going on in Russia, you know, with the oppression, poverty, and the total dictatorial, autocratic role of the Tsar. So what happened? Well, then you wonder, well, why are they even then hanging out together? Well, because of intermarriages. You know, Nicholas's mother was a beautiful Danish princess who was the sister of Edward's wife. So that was a direct connection. And then also Nicholas married a granddaughter of Queen Victoria. But also Nicholas, you know, was a very cosmopolitan man. He spoke very good English. And he traveled throughout Europe quite a bit until, you know, maybe 3 or 4 years before World War I. But one of the reasons they were on this trip was that Edward wanted it, because Edward was trying to extend his bear hug and trying to get his nephew, Nicholas, into a diplomatic entanglement with England and France, because everyone could see that Germany was arming and becoming more and more threatening, and that perhaps Germany and Austria would hook up, as they did, and then there would have to be a very strong defense. So, you know, Edward, you know, on the surface, it was, we love our family, let's get together, the children should should be together, and we'll all have these great dinners, and we'll eat lobster and drink champagne. But also, Edward was trying to get Nicholas into this alliance, which, of course, as we know, did happen. So Nicholas, you know, was always a little reluctant. He was of mixed feelings. I mean, England did have elected leaders. It wasn't really a natural fit for the Tsar. but his wife was English, and he got along very well with George V, who he famously resembled. They actually, some people look like twins, and they had a lot in common, those two. George V loved stamp collecting, hunting, simple life with his wife and his children. And Nicholas lived very simply out in Tsarskoye Selo, their preferred palace. They lived sort of an English country life, which was a big shock when people were able to finally see how they lived after the Romanovs' fall. They said, this is how, one of the richest families in the world wants to live, with like very plain furniture and plain food. But so they had a lot in common. So they had this meeting, and the reason that it was on the Isle of Wight is not just because it sounds great to be on an island. It was because, and this actually leads into the story to come. Nicholas was a huge security risk. There were a lot of people in England who would have liked to shoot him, even in 1909. There were a lot of anarchists running around, but also I think the labor leader of England referred to him at the time in 1909 as a blood-stained creature.
Oh, my.
So, there was a lot of tension between the two systems. But within the systems, there's actually people, who are related to each other and who like each other.
And George and Nicholas were two of those. George was the Duke of York, and then became the Prince of Wales, I understand, and then eventually took over as King George V. So they had that relationship, but it kind of complicated that decision that George had to make later on about offering asylum to the Romanovs after Nicholas had to abdicate in 1917, and the family was placed under house arrest. So George, from what I understand, was pretty upset about that forced abdication, but in the end, it was him who declined to grant asylum to the Romanovs. What was behind that decision?
Well, even when Alexandra was marrying Nicholas, Victoria, you'd think she'd want to marry one of her favorite grandchildren. And Alexandra was beautiful and devout and seemed like a great wife material. But Victoria did not really want her to marry Nicholas because of, I fear for her on such an unsteady throne, prophecy. And what happened was that when Nicholas and Alexandra, when he abdicated and took the whole family off the chessboard, he also took his son with him, which a lot of people thought that when Nicholas abdicated, the son, who was around 11 years old, would become the new Tsar with a regent. But what they may not have known is that Alexei had hemophilia through his mother, through Victoria's family, and was not well at all. And his father knew that he would be forced to have nothing to do with his son, and he couldn't bear the thought of leaving a sick kid and just abandoning him to his fate. So what happened was George was quite concerned, and even more concerned was the British ambassador in Russia, and tried to get involved. But there were various forces, and it's kind of hard for us now because the fate of the Romanovs has become so iconic and so legendary and so tragic. And when you read about it, the way they died, it's very upsetting. I mean, I'd like to find anyone who isn't upset by it, but you have to go back to before then. And what happened was that even though the British and French had pressured Nicholas to join in World War I, when he abdicated, there was a scramble for those two countries to keep Russia in the war. And they actually wanted to make a deal with the government that was succeeding Nicholas. So it's not as if they wanted to just, comfort Nicholas and take care of him. They were desperate to keep Russia in the war, to keep Germany occupied in the East. So they were like, Kerensky, let's make a deal. And then faithfully, even after that, when the Bolsheviks came out, it was really apparent to many people that the Romanovs were not going to be safe once the Bolsheviks took over. Kerensky did what he could. And a lot of people say, well, why didn't they get out right away? Well, there are some very good reasons why they didn't get out right away. For one thing, many people may not realize that 3 of the children were very sick with measles. So it would have been hard to move them. But the other bigger reason, and there's a very good book about, the race to save the Romanovs by Helen Rappaport, which, very long book that will take everybody through this in detail. And I've read that along with a lot of other books and sources on this. You couldn't just go to the airport and get a plane to London, to Heathrow, here I come. No. And so they were stuck in a country that was in the middle of a revolution. Okay. And the railroads were in the hands of different factions every few miles. So you couldn't take the railroads out of the country. So you couldn't even get to a body of water safely. And what the Kerensky problem was that he really wanted to save their lives. There's not any debate on that. But he could not find a way to safely get them out, because you'd have to put them on Russia's so huge. You'd have to put them on the railroad. But the railroads were increasingly controlled by the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks, flat out would love to have gotten their hands on Nicholas and killed him. And so it was very hard to keep him safe. So what happened was that George made some overtures, but as everybody in England knows, and I think most people in America knows, George is not running the country. And his prime minister and his ministers, they really wanted Russia to stay in the war. And they also, some of them thought Nicholas was a blood-stained creature. As I said, that's a well-known quote. So what happened was, I think a lot of people just decided not to worry about it. And it's tragic because they were, yes, under house arrest, and then they were moved into more and more ominous areas. And they were moved into the part of the country, Siberia, that was the most Bolshevik of all. And, what happened was that George famously was chastised in some way by his government that he could not make an overture of that on his own. The British government would have had to do it. And at that point, they were desperately still trying to keep Russia in the war, and they were trying to deal with the people who were running Russia, soon to be the Soviet Union. And so, George was basically told, go back in your palace and your ceremonial role, basically. We all love The Crown, right? The series. And there's a scene early on where Jared Harris does a great job with George V, although he looks nothing like him, but that's okay. And he says, I'm quite a stickler for the Constitution, and his father was even more so. They were rule followers. And that's one of the reasons they're still around. They knew their boundary, and they could not, to make this kind of overture to bring the Romanovs in would have been very politically dangerous, because there was a rising anarchist, socialist, revolutionary spirit in England. And if George had been seen to bring the Romanovs to safety, the way he and his wife, Queen Mary, felt, and this is what historians pretty much agree on, is that might have endangered him. He had just renamed his family the Windsors. And, and then what happened was, Lenin came in and he took Russia out of the war. And so then they had no leverage. Now, they were able to get Nicholas's mother and some of the other royals out of the country, because they had already gotten to the water, to a body of water. And the British were able to send a boat, and just in the nick of time, get them out. But there were many who did not make it out, and, they were killed just as brutally, and believe it or not, even more so than Nicholas and his family. The Bolsheviks were not kidding. They shot them. There's a famous case of Alexandra's sister married a Grand Duke and became an abbess after her father died, and devoted herself to the poor. And she did not want to leave Russia, which was a huge mistake. And she and some others were taken, and they were thrown down a mine shaft. And somebody threw some grenades in after them and left them just to die of their wounds, starved to death. Yes. And they were heard singing hymns down there as they were dying. It's just a terrible story. But so I think what happened was, when it became clear that things were going to get very bad, that there was, believe it or not, a Hail Mary here, if I could use that expression, in that people felt that the Kaiser, who was related to Alexandra, might have been able to make it a condition. We make peace with you. And he even said, but the German princesses, it's just what he referred to, Alexandra and her daughters, should be safe. And not to upset Lenin adherents here, but he was famous, as was Stalin later, for, not telling the truth when it came to the European powers. And he just wouldn't give them a straight answer. And so by the time that they were in deep, deep trouble, they were in a part of Russia that was extremely hard to get out of. There was no one, there were some white Russian forces that got together, some people who really didn't like the way Russia was heading. And even though Nicholas and Alexander, and this is another thing that people don't quite realize now, they were really unpopular because of Rasputin and other things. And so, they didn't have a lot of people who wanted to fight to keep them. And so then though, but murdering them, that's something else indeed. And also the white Russians, the as they call them, the people who wanted to get rid of the Bolsheviks, the communists, they did try to get some money together, get an army together, and move toward where Nicholas was. And that is what killed them, because the Bolsheviks could not allow that to happen. So that did bring on their death sentence. But I think that probably they were going to be killed anyway. I mean, I think that George, people think he's a moral coward. I don't know what more he could have done, really, because as you say, he wasn't running the country, and it would have put him in a dangerous position. But I know that it was never mentioned in his presence after his friend and relative Nicholas was known to be. Although people didn't even know for sure that he was dead at first, because Lenin was not exactly putting it out on the press corps.
Yeah, those were definitely different days as far as communication and the press
if they were alive or dead.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then they thought maybe just Nicholas was dead, which, to be honest, even though I don't want anybody to be killed without a trial and process or killed at all, but the fact that the whole family was wiped out, people really didn't foresee that. And they were quite horrified and nauseated by it. And perhaps to make up for it, some of the Romanovs, Nicholas's sister, settled in England and were given places to live that were very nice, that were sort of off to the side of where the British royals were. I think that there was a great deal of gnashing of the teeth over this, and real sorrow and what had happened to this family. Although I think that George and Mary felt that, Alexandra was so devoted to her husband that she would not have wanted to leave him. And, it's hard. And they didn't really want to leave Russia either. That's another thing. They didn't. He loved Russia, Nicholas. And she loved Russia too, although that was not believed at the time. She was seen as a spy for the Germans, even though no historian thinks she was. She hated the Kaiser. So it's a family tragedy. And the only thing I'll say, though, about the relationship between George and Nicholas, they got along very well. They looked alike. They were the kind of people who I think are very close and friendly and warm when there's not a lot of stress. But, you put World War I into
seems pretty familiar with any family situation, doesn't it?
It's like any family when you have a big divorce or somebody loses their job or loses their home.
Or his head.
Suddenly, it's a testing, isn't it, of those ties. And did George do everything he could? Maybe not. Maybe he could have worked some back channels. Maybe he could have gotten some money to some people who could have moved in quicker. But whether he should have just sort of swept them up and brought them into England, you have to go back to 1917 and 1918. And, when the travel conditions and the lack of control that the people had over their own country and in Russia. And also, you can't leave out of the equation the hatred for Nicholas among the Bolsheviks, who, I mean, when they knew that they were going to probably execute them, they called the house of special purpose. Well, you see, this is not very spontaneous. And the guy who was in charge, I don't have his name handy, but he was very organized, and he went through his men, and there were some guards who did not want to kill the girls.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And so he replaced them with people who were willing to do it. So there were people who were, and again, it's hard to get into that mindset, isn't it? People who are willing to kill teenage girls and a young boy, and servants. What did the servants do? Except, there was a doctor, there was a bunch of people killed in that basement.
Those are the realities of the politics of the time. But when you get back into the family ties you were speaking of, there were dynamics for other members of the royal family at this same time, and I'm referring to Alexandra and Queen Mary. Were they not cousins? I mean,
yes, but they didn't really like each other, and that might have been a factor.
Oh yeah,
yeah.
What was their relationship like?
Alexandra was a favorite granddaughter, and Mary was actually an interesting case. She was the daughter of a close relative of Victoria's, but her father, I mean, these things seem ridiculous now, but he came from a morganatic marriage, which means that his parents were not equal in rank. So he was a little down the ladder. And Mary, who became Queen Mary, she grew up in pretty much obscurity. Now, she was very intelligent and well-educated, so let's not think that she's out there, as a little match girl or anything. But she was not like Alexandra, who was sort of pampered and fussed over. She lost her mother when she was young, and everybody felt very bad for her. And Victoria sort of took a hand in raising her. And some people think she was her favorite grandchild, and she had a lot to choose from. So what happened was that Mary was someone who really wanted to do well in life. What's wrong with that? And so when she got a chance to make a royal marriage, it was to George's older brother, Eddie. And Eddie was someone who had some issues, drinking, dissolute, running around. There is a totally untrue theory that he is Jack the Ripper. He's not. He is not Jack the Ripper. But he died of, I think it was typhus, when he was engaged to Mary. And she, without turning a hair, turned to his younger brother. And they got engaged, and she married the next one and became queen. And Alexandra just wasn't very warm to her, because I think one of Alexandra's qualities is she was quite arrogant, and she always wanted a lot of precedent made of her, and she just never really treated Mary very warmly. And I think that might have been a factor later on. You know what I mean? That Alexandra was never very good to her. And now she's the Queen of England. And I'm not saying that she told George, we don't want that woman here, but I just don't think that there was a friendship there beyond the being related. While other people had strong kinship and also friendship, most notably Nicolas and George. And Alexandra was very close to her relatives, who were the House of Hesse in Germany. And they would all get together in Germany and have skating holidays, and they're raising their children together, very much like a large extended family now, where you get together for weddings, you get together for funerals. Edward's funeral was the last really big funeral, where all of these heads of state, who were kings, the kings and rulers of Europe turned out. But Nicholas did not. He sent his brother because, again, he's a security risk. And the British police, there's no way they could, keep him from being, shot from the side. So he didn't come. But he himself Nicholas, they're pretty sure that he didn't realize that George changed his mind or there was any problem. He probably would have been very hurt if he knew that, for instance, France, okay, there's no relatives there, but France really pulled Russia into that war. They pulled Nicholas in, and then they couldn't have done less for him. They just didn't care. Because again, France was sort of a country with a lot of socialists, and, Nicholas was very used, let's put it that way. Now, was he a great ruler? No. A lot of people say he was very indecisive. He was very not up to the job. He became Tsar at a young age. His father died before many people thought he would. And he was very upset when his father died. He says, I don't even know how to talk to the ministers. I don't know how to do this, basically. I don't know how to rule Russia, but he had to, right? It's a hereditary situation. So, Nicholas, didn't really have many what we would call friends. He was extremely close to his wife.
And his wife had a major effect, didn't she, on how the world viewed her?
Really running that marriage.
Mm-hmm.
And from the very beginning, I think people thought maybe, ironically, it was Kaiser Wilhelm who sort of talked her into marrying Nicholas. She was attracted to him. She wanted to marry him, but she was very into being a Protestant. And, Russian Orthodoxy was scary, and she didn't want to convert. And Wilhelm, who liked to interfere in all the family dynamics and like push himself where he's not wanted as much as possible. And he really pushed Alexandra into this marriage. And some people think that he thought he was doing he was going to be like Frederick the Great, putting Sophie, an obscure German princess, on the Russian throne to be the next Catherine the Great, but he did not get that. Alexandra was not a good Tsarina. She just wasn't. She was obsessed with her health. She was very shy. She didn't get along with his family. Now, if we're going to talk about families, that's a problem. She didn't get along with her mother-in-law. She didn't get along that well with even her own ladies in waiting hardly saw her. She just wanted to be with Nicholas and her children and a few trusted friends. And then, of course, comes Rasputin. And the reason that he gained so much power is that he alone, through his hypnotic force of his personality, I don't know how he did it, but he, in his presence, Alexei, and because hemophilia, you couldn't treat it, and it was agony for this kid, and any parent would be in bad shape sitting by the bed of a boy who's screaming in pain, and Rasputin could come in and the boy's pain would ease somewhat. So, that's why she became so obsessed with him, although I've read some theories that the person he really calmed down was her. Mm-hmm. And so when she became calmer, she had a symbiotic relationship with her son, then the son got calmer. And then he was able to bear up a little easier. There's a lot of psychology here. But, just as with Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, there were a lot of scurrilous pamphlets and rumors that they were having sex with, Marie Antoinette was having sex with her, half the people in France, and she was disgusting. And there were a lot of rumors in Russia that Alexandra was having sex with Rasputin and that she was leading him to her daughters too. I mean, there really were. It was very strong, and it was very damaging to the Romanovs. And so back in England and Denmark, where, there are a lot of other relatives, and all over, as we know, Prince Philip was Danish and Greek. I mean, they were everywhere. They were very worried about Alexandra and Nicholas and their marriage and Rasputin, but they wouldn't listen to anybody. Would not listen to anybody. Would not. So
they became kind of isolated?
Moderate. And they just sort of almost marched to their fate. It's just really sad. If Nicholas had married someone else, who knows what would have happened? I'm not saying we'd still have a czar, but that she was not good for Russia, and but they were. It's a hard one because they were very much in love. They were devoted to each other, like few couples really. I think even more than George and Mary, because that was such an arranged marriage. While Nicholas really picked Alexandra for himself. He was very attracted to her. He was in love with her. And they were actually devoted parents. You know, you always hear about the aristocrats who don't want their kids in the room except for half hour before dinner and then, you know, go. But they really, really loved their children and spent a lot of time with them. And of course, the Russian, the aristocratic class of St. Petersburg were like, you know, this is just appalling. They're living like middle class, you know, sentimental, you know, fools. You know, they're not really like living up to the Romanov lifestyle. You know, it's like, okay. But they were, you know, a very close family. And there are some, excuse me, there are some people who think that, you know, even though their end was horrible, they could not have faced being separated from one another.
Mm-hmm,
you know,
mm-hmm.
I'm not saying they would have preferred to be shot, but, you know, what would be the answer? And I think it's so hard for people to face. That's why there's all these ridiculous stories about Anastasia, you know, having somehow they missed, she survived, she snuck out the back. And, you know, because it's so hard. I think it's just so hard to accept the reality of their death. But, you know, what is interesting is that the British royals, I think, felt very bad about what happened to the Romanovs all the way. And then when they found their bones, you know, the burial site in the 90s, they did very quietly. Prince Philip was one of the chief donators of DNA, and it was through him that they were able to, you know, ID all of them. Because remember, Nicholas's mother was a Danish princess, so he was not, you know, purely Romanov, and the Danish connection was where you get Philip. So that was how they were able to confirm their identities, and then they were reburied. And you know, I understand that Ekaterinburg is a place of great homage and pilgrimage now. You know, in Russia, there's a real feeling of sorrow. You know, that what they did to their czar. But you know, yes, I think that the Windsors felt, and I think George felt very terrible. I mean, as anyone would, that about what happened. But I think he also felt a little frightened for himself. I mean, even though it's sort of inconceivable that the English would ever act like that toward their monarchs, you know, except for Charles II. You know, he had to look out for his family. That was his responsibility, to keep them, you know, the firm, as it's called, to keep the firm going.
But you know, these royal dynamics and relationships, they weren't really by accident, were they? I mean, at the heart of the marriages, what was Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's their grand plan to bring some sort of unity to Europe, so that they could avoid that devastation that was caused by the previous Napoleonic Wars. Do you think Victoria and Albert succeeded with that plan?
Well, they tried their best, but what happened is that strategy was doomed by human feeling. And what happened was that they very much wanted their oldest daughter, the Princess Royal Victoria, who, you know, in some ways was their most impressive child, to marry into the Prussian royal family. And she did. And she brought a lot of intelligence and idealism into the marriage, and she and her husband were very close. But their child, Kaiser Wilhelm, did not seem to have any affection for his own parents. And you see, the plan, you think then, okay, then they would have a kid who would then be friendly toward England and have a peaceful Europe. But it just didn't work out. You know, Wilhelm had some issues, emotional issues, and very much wanted to have Germany be more prominent and warlike. And, you know, he just couldn't be reasoned with. You know, he was very heartless and terrible to his own mother. You know, so, and of course, don't we all know families like that, though, where, you know, the parents and the son, they don't get along. So I think that their plan then their children married. Another marriage that didn't quite work out the way they wanted to was a granddaughter married the King of Spain. And that could have been a very important dynastic marriage. But what happened was she brought hemophilia unknowingly into at least two of their sons were hemophiliac. And unfortunately, he really held that against his wife. And it really hurt their marriage, that he had these suffering children. And then now his dynasty was in peril. So you see that, you feel like, well, I'm going to put these wonderful children and grandchildren into all these positions. But then, whether it's emotional issues or it's medical issues, but things get in the way. And I mean, I can't say that because Wilhelm hated his English relatives and that's why that's why we have World War One. You can't really go that far. I mean, there were a lot of other diplomatic and reasons for the war. But I think what really upset a lot of people who were observing what happened with the Great War was that all these family ties didn't stop anything. It's like, why do we have all these people who are the head of countries who are cousins and have grown up together and they go to all these weddings together and they holiday together, and then that doesn't stop anything from happening,
simply because of human nature.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't enough. The fact that you run into someone in a wedding and you get along really well, that's not enough. I mean, what happened with the Habsburgs was that the last Holy Roman Emperor, Karl, really wanted to pull Austria out and make peace with France, and his wife had French ties, and he tried to find some channels that he could try to do something to stop all of this horrible slaughter. And when it came out, people were very, very angry at him, and he got into a lot of trouble. So they're like, "You're not a diplomat." It's because, just as in England, the people who are running the show are not the royals. They're not. They're not making all of the really important decisions. And so England's in transition here. The Kaiser and Nicholas in Russia are two of the only ones who are really making all the decisions. In all these other countries, especially France, there's elected governments. So it's getting very messy. And so the fact that you have, these very wealthy royal families who are intermarried in a way that not only did that seem useless, but it almost seemed offensive, after World War One. And a lot of people were sort of shoved off their thrones if they didn't want to go willingly. I think there was one ruler, I want to say in Denmark or Norway, who said, I'm not, I should be the next ruler, but I would prefer if the people of my country could vote and decide if they want to have me do that. And, I think that's actually the right decision, to say, this sort of, royal blood, running through your veins, makes you semi-divine and empowered to make decisions. That's, after the 1920s, nobody really could feel that way.
Yeah, and that's kind of my next question, is that, of course, the British royals and most of the other royal families don't have the type of power that they had, say, 150 to 200 years ago. I mean, maybe they have a different type of power or a different type of purpose, but does this type of situation where you have members of royal families intermarrying, does it still exist in some way today?
That I think that there was the French are interesting because, you'd think that they would have completely given up. The descendants of Louis, not Louis XVI, his brother, the Bourbons, but they haven't. they were sort of over there. We're here if you need us. We're ready to come back. But what's sort of really funny is you also have the Bonapartes who are all in another corner saying, we're ready to come back too. Of course, the people of France don't want either of them, but My point is that there are still some dynastic marriages. I think that one of the Bourbon heirs married a woman who was of royal blood. And I don't know why people really feel the need to do this, except that one of the really fun parlor games that people like to say is, if there was a czar in Russia, who would it be? I mean, Nicholas's family is out. And then you look at, but he had a lot of cousins, a lot of brothers. Like, who would be the czar of Russia, if there were to be a czar? And of course, I mean, I think Mr. Putin would have something to say about this. But anyway, just to play that game. And the reason that it is a game, and it's very difficult, is that there are still people who are involved in Romanov royal circles who take very seriously morganatic marriage. That if you marry a woman for love, instead of she has the right royal pedigree, you can't rule, and neither can your children. You're all tainted, So that's the only, and of course it's all academic, because they're never going to take over again. But they're in some quarters of Europe, yes, they still take this sort of seriously. Now, they don't, obviously, Prince William is not married a royal, and a lot of people feel that they're a great team and their children are fantastic. So nobody's complaining. But I think that like Prince Albert of Monaco married a woman who was not at all royal, right? And I even think that the present king of Spain has married someone who maybe was a television announcer, And so I think
that's really marrying down, isn't it?
Has pretty much gone away, and now it's just seen as, but I think that that's why when you look at Prince Charles, why the fact that he didn't marry the woman he really loved, Camilla, but was sort of talked into marrying someone who was over, the Spencers, Diana's family. Some people say had bluer blood than the royal family. I mean, they came down hundreds of years of peerages and purity, and that she was actually a very, I don't want to say old-fashioned choice, but she was a very aristocratic choice for him. And yeah, look what happened. Didn't work out. But I think now with the royals, it's all going to be like William and Kate. It's going to be, I love you, but also I think that you're right for this. And so we're going to work together. And I think that's the future of these monarchies, if they're still running around, that they like anybody else, want to marry someone they're in love with, but also you have to bear in mind, as we know, not everybody, it's our own Meghan Markle, not everybody can handle it. And so, there has to be, I think there's real affection, love, and respect in these marriages now, but there also has to be some, can you really handle this role? Where you're going to be in you're going to be in a bowl where everybody's looking at you and judging you, and you're going to be under a lot of pressure. Of course, there's benefits too. But I think that the whole Victoria and Albert thing, I'd have to say that no, it did not work out too well. It spread hemophilia all over the place. And even though there were all of these other countries that, or just parts of Germany that took on royals from Victoria's family, it didn't stop anything when it came to war. And then by the time you got to World War II, I mean, I don't think that there was any relevance at all. And in fact, I think Hitler is supposed to have been someone who hated the Habsburgs and had no use for royals at all. And so you really only had the English royal family still, hanging in there, still a force, still respected,
in just a different way.
In a different way.
Yeah.
I mean, George the Sixth, Bertie, son of George V, and his wife Elizabeth. I think that one of the best things they did was during the Blitz, they didn't leave London, and they walked around where bombs had fallen, and they they really made great efforts to comfort and lead. And so I think that's where the family is seen as being really important in its time. They didn't flee into the countryside or go to Canada. Some people even thought that the children should be sent out of the country.
Yeah, I think they even had accommodations for them in British Columbia. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So,
but they showed some true leadership.
Right. And now, it's interesting because they still do observe protocol, though. I think the King of Spain came to visit Elizabeth, and he did not have to do the full homage. His wife didn't have to do the full curtsy that others do because they're seen as on the same level. So I think there are very thick books on protocol and etiquette still, on who gets to do what, in the presence of the Queen, and I think there was actually it was an incident where I think it was a Canadian politician at a diplomatic function, sort of like touched her arm, not in any kind of creepy way, but just, and it's like, oh my, no. All of these rules and protocols snap into place. It's like, you've done something terrible, so there is still this mystique that surrounds them. It's still there. But and I have to say, I think they're the only ones, right? I mean, who else has that kind of power in all of Europe but the Windsors? It's kind of amazing. And so then you take that back to George V and his decision, even though he felt terrible about Nicholas, he didn't do everything that he possibly could, and he definitely didn't make any public gestures of support after certain. But and although some people think that's terrible, he was looking out for his own family and he was being very careful about his own position. And perhaps that's the reason why they're still there. You know what I mean? There is an argument for that he
self-preservation
to his limited role.
So, Nancy, before we go here, I just want to go back to something that you already touched upon earlier in the conversation. When I was looking at the photo of in the article which you wrote for Town and Country magazine, and the photo of the earlier family gathering from, I think it was 1898 you had in the cut line there. There is Nicholas, there's Alexandra with her grandmother, Queen Victoria, and Albert. They're all looking at Alexandra holding her infant daughter. So then you think ahead some years, and then you realize that half of that family that you're looking at in that photo will be shot and beaten to death. And it's hard to, as you mentioned, it's hard to wrap your head around the fact that the people in the photo are responsible for so many world-altering events.
I know.
So some of which are the deaths of thousands of people, yet here they all are in this photograph looking like a normal family. That's really hard to perceive.
It is, that they had so much power. And, a lot of people have said about Nicholas, and even to a certain extent, George V, that these were not brilliant people. They were not intellectuals. They were not culturally sophisticated. They were brought up to be, what they were, and they were not maybe perhaps mentally all that amazing. And yet, you see it, and yet, they had loves and feelings just like anybody else. And Victoria did really look out for her grandchildren. She worried about them. She fussed over them. She, she worried about their marriages. She worried about, their happiness. And so in some ways it is kind of interesting. They are, very much, Victoria and Albert were very much like a quote unquote normal family, for their time. And they had the kinds of feelings that people have now, toward, they had a real marriage with a lot of love, but fighting too, disappointments. And yet, yes, when you look at that photo, you think, and I have to say that even in 1909, I think that they had no idea what was coming, no idea. In fact, there were members of Nicholas's family who, his cousins and uncles, who were very frightened about what was happening in Russia, and that it was all going to be swept away, and them with it, and that they might lose their lives. And they went to Nicholas and just begged him to make some concessions, to get some better ministers, to listen to other voices. And he would not listen to anybody. So, so there are many tragedies to the Romanovs. And that is one of them, that it wasn't as if he wasn't warned, and that he wasn't pleaded with, to do things differently. But he would not listen. And that is the big difference between him and George. And it is interesting that they could be close friends when they had completely different ideas of what it was to be a ruler, because George did listen to people. And when his ministers said, you can't make offers to the Tsar to come to England, you can't be publicly supporting him, that is not what the government's policy is. He said, okay, I stand back then. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't think that people thought that there was going to be shootings in the basement, but it's such a different time. Now we seem to know everything about what's going on all over the world,
whether we want to know it or not.
Yes. And I'm always behind in my podcasts and my books, and trying to keep up with what's going on in the Ukraine now, and it's just trying to follow everything. But back then, I just don't think that in England or in France, they knew how bad it was for Nicholas under the Bolsheviks until it was too late. But, it was probably too late almost immediately. Like I said, because of how hard it would be to get out of Russia. You would have had to have very well-financed and well-organized people in motion, ready to scoop them up and then somehow convey them out. And that didn't happen, they just didn't, so they were left to their fate. And, one thing that really upsets me personally is that supposedly the oldest daughter, Olga, who was sort of perhaps the most intelligent of the daughters, not that any of them were stupid, but she was the most intelligent and sort of the most spiritual. She was very moody, and she became much more depressed than anyone else. And I think it's because she could see what might be happening down the road. And so I find that very sad, because that's not a burden that a young woman should have, to see her family on the precipice like that. Nicholas and Alexander were both very religious, and while they were under house arrest, they would constantly it's God's will, we will do this, we will do that. And that I don't know if that works for everybody.
So. Well, it definitely sealed their fate, I think. And so many people are still fascinated by the fate of the Romanovs and by royalty in general. So I really thank you for taking us through that period, Nancy. I know a lot of people are still very interested in that. So thank you so much for spending time
today. Thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Okay. And I thank all of you for listening in. We'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.